Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Hello, how are you? I greet you from New York City. It's hotter than you know what in New York City. I love your California. Got off the plane and had a great time. I'm Alyce Mott. I have the distinction of having written this libretto. Please, no tomatoes until at the end of it. And I've also been asked to give you a little bit of background on Cyrano de Bergerac, written by Victor Herbert. Whoever knew that Victor Herbert wrote anything that had to do with Cyrano? There's a good story about it, but first let me set the scene for you. This is America of 1897. 1898, 99. It's the end of the century. We're getting ready to launch into the 1900s. But we haven't had a whole lot of operetta work going on, period. The first real operetta written by an American was written by Reginald de Koven. It was called Robin Hood. And it just happened to have a libretto by Harry B. Smith. You're going to hear me talk about Harry B. Smith a lot. The B stands for Bache or Bache, depending on how you want to pronounce it, B-A-C-H-E. So Harry had the distinction of writing the first American libretto. And that made Harry feel like he really was pretty good and knew exactly what he was doing. There's no television, of course. There's no movies. There's no recording. There's none of the electronic things that we know about. There is nothing but the stage. Now, when Cyrano was written by Edmond Rostand, who lived between, 1868 and 1918, it was like a rock star was born in Paris. They could not get enough of it. They gave him curtain call after curtain call after curtain call. The world fell in love with Cyrano. Why? Because every single one of you will see a little bit of Cyrano in you. It's a very universal character. Richard Mansfield was a major American actor at the time, and he got an authorized permission to do Cyrano in America, and he opened it in 1898 in New York City for a relatively short run, about 8 weeks, and then he took it on tour. In short, Mansfield showed the whole country the story of Cyrano before Francis Wilson decided to do his operatic version, his comedic version. At this time, vaudeville was the thing. George M. Cohan is going to come along in 1901 and write the first real musical comedy by extending his vaudeville sketches into a full evening. But that hasn't happened yet. And vaudevillians were desperate to find some way to uplift themselves. They didn't want to be seen as just comic buffoons. So there were a couple of these guys who were fairly well known. The first one is Francis Daniels, who had already run into Herbert. He had seen what Herbert did with his first operetta in 1894 called Prince Ananias. And Frank Daniels decided that he wanted to work with Herbert. And he had his producer contact Harry B. Smith. And Harry B. Smith had seen Prince Ananias and didn't think much of it. So he didn't really want to work with Herbert. Everybody, all right, if I have to, I have to. And in all of Herbert's career, he never hired anybody himself. He always had a producer. And usually that producer hired him to write something. And the producer would then find the book writer or the librettist, who sometimes was also the lyricist, the person who wrote the words to the songs. But in some cases it was both. So Herbert and Harry B. Smith met the first time with a Frank Daniels production called The Wizard of the Nile. It's 1895, Wizard of the Nile. And they had a so-so success with that. Frank Daniels was a vaudevillian comic, so he did his Frank Daniels thing. And it's a kind of poor book, not a great book. Harry B. wrote it. You'll notice I call him Harry B. a lot. I apologize to Mr. Smith, but that's kind of where those of us who know Harry B. kind of call him that. The Wizard of the Nile was so successful that Frank Daniels was going to come back in 1890. Let's see, when was the Wizard of the Nile? In 1897, he liked the situation so much they came back and asked Herbert to do another one, and this time he produced, and it was called The Idol's Eye. They're exotic tales set Lord knows where, usually involving stealing some poor idol's piece of jewelry, and then it floats around from person to person. But Cyrano was a slightly different matter. Cyrano was Francis Wilson, who, again, it's easy to get Frank Daniels and Francis Wilson a little mixed up, but Francis Wilson was a vaudevillian who heard Herbert's music, which was elevated from everything else that anybody had heard written for the New York stage. Why? Because Herbert was coming from Frankfurt, Germany. He was steeped in the Viennese tradition. He played with Strauss orchestra. He played with royal orchestras. He was a true romantic, and he knew how to write a tune. Really wonderful tunes. So Francis Wilson said, let's get Herbert to write a new Cyrano, and let's lighten up this story because it is so sad in the end, and it is so down and dark. I want to lighten it up. So he gave lots of interviews about how he was going to lighten it up. Keep in mind, though, that good old Richard Mansfield had covered the country doing a real Cyrano. So the country already knew Cyrano dies, Christian dies, Roxanne's unhappy. Everybody knows that story. So along comes Francis Wilson, and he hires Harry B. sort of to write it, but something must have been in the back of Harry's mind, because Harry wrote under a pseudonym. Mr. Reed, Stuart Reed is the name on the book. But Stuart Reed was really Harry B. Smith. Okay? He wasn't quite ready to hang his hat, so to speak, on this libretto. It was produced by Kirk LaSalle, I believe, and and the basic thing that there's a little major wrinkle. Not only is Francis Wilson a vaudevillian, so he's not an actor, he's a shtick actor. He's a fall-on-his-face buffoon. He's a physical comedy guy. But the big wrinkle was he couldn't sing. Okay? And he cast his girlfriend as Roxanne. And guess what else? She couldn't sing. So when you sit here and listen to this score tonight, I want you to keep in the back of your mind, or remind yourself in intermission, that neither of the two leads could sing. Okay, major difficulty. And it was all pointed out very often in the press. The press went out of their way to say, Lulu Glasser is really cute and really moves well on stage, but she can't sing. So that's a little on the shaky side for a show. The show opened, a lot of this is, I think, in your program too, but the show opened on September 18th. The interesting thing about this show opening is that it's the first of 4 in 5 months that Herbert wrote. Now think about that. 4 scores in 5 months. And the dates I'm going to give you are not the opening on Broadway, they're what he was doing from the time that he had all those scores done. He was going from rehearsal to rehearsal. So Cyrano's first performance was on September 11th. On October 2nd, he had to go see The Singing Girl, or he had to have The Singing Girl, which was written for Alice Nielsen, who was a super voice at the time. And he had to go see that that was in good shape. And then he had another one called the Amir that was opening for the very first time. When I say first time, that's out of town playing. In other words, the score's got to be done because you can't rewrite much of the score. You can rewrite a lot of the book. You can throw songs in, put songs out, but the score itself has to be pretty much done. So the Amir, he had to have ready to go by October 9th. That's 7 days after The Singing Girl. And then, just for good measure, he did the Viceroy, which had its first performance ever on February 12th. So he took a little vacation. Didn't have to work quite so hard. Now, the reason I tell you all this is because somebody wrote, and I don't think it's a credited review, and it's often the case in this time, got it, thank you, that the non-credited reviews. But they were accusing Herbert of having a swelled head and reporting on what Herbert was saying about the books for each of these 4 shows. And in each case, he was telling the librettist that they were doing awful jobs. And if I didn't like you, I would pull my score away because your libretto is so awful. Well, when Cyrano opened, the press agreed with him. The press agreed with him. What was wrong with the libretto? It was fine through the first act, followed Rostand just nicely, fine through the second act, Ragueneau and his cafe were there, and then it got to the third act, and all of a sudden, then you had a balcony scene. Awfully late in the game to have the balcony scene there, and we didn't go to a convent that you're going to go to tonight. We went to the battle scene, and everybody lived. Everybody in the play lived. And you got the feeling, while there wasn't a wedding on stage, you got the feeling that they were going off. Cyrano and Roxanne were going off to be married. What that does when you know the story is you sit there and you say, wait a minute, that's not the Cyrano I know, that's not the Cyrano I expected to see, and you get great disappointment. So audiences got greatly disappointed. It lasted 28 performances. 28 performances, and then what was even funnier was that they brought in one reviewer told Mr. Smith, who was listed as the lyricist, that he really ought to go and talk to Mr. Reed and take over the libretto. that Mr. Reed had missed the boat, but Harry B. could probably do it. Well, then they brought in a guy by the name of J. Cheever Goodwin, and he rewrote. And here's what he did, too, if he diagnoses Cyrano's nose. He changed that line to, if he diagnoses Cyrano's proboscis. Try singing. Listen to, when you get to the Song of the Nose, try sticking proboscis in with all the rhymes. It just doesn't work. So Mr. Goodwin didn't do any good at all. So they packed up on Broadway and they took it on tour. And all those little people in the hinterlands that you would think wouldn't know anything, they didn't like it any better than New Yorkers did. So it stopped very quickly, and it promptly got lost. The Library of Congress said, in about 1999, I was working, no, not that early, earlier, 1995, 96, I was working on a Babes in Toyland. I had met Wayne Shirley, who was a wonderful librarian at the Library of Congress, and Wayne told me that I should look further than Babes in Toyland because there was much more wonderful stuff out there. And I said, well, how about Cyrano? And he said, I've never seen it. Never seen it, never seen it, never seen it. He told me for 6 months he'd never seen it. And then all of a sudden one day at my office in New York on a fax machine, I got these 3 pages and this very chagrined letter saying, Alyce, I'm so sorry, guess what I found? And he found the Cyrano orchestrations. There was no book. That book has not been seen since they closed closed it down. Whatever happened to it, I don't know. I've searched for a long time. If I ever find that libretto, I just want to read it. I just want to see what it was. So I had a maestro. I was working for a maestro who was my creative partner at the time, Dino Anagnost, and he said, well, I want to do Cyrano. I want to do this show. And so we pulled out these orchestra parts that were, in fact, the worst orchestra parts I have ever seen in my entire life. They were 100 years old in every possible way. They were marked up. They were awful, awful, awful. And we had just done a Babes in Toyland with some fairly 100-year-old not Tams Whitmark, but Whitmark and Son orchestra parts, and they were pretty bad. That was the first thing. And then we did Fortune Teller, and again we used handwritten orchestra parts. By this time, my union orchestra was ready to kill me. And when I put Cyrano on their stand, they were definitely ready to kill me. Hard to read, handwritten. Where is this note really fitting on the thing? It took much longer to get through, which meant my maestro was ready to kill me because clock was ticking. But once we actually got it, I went back to Rostand, and I said, if we're going to do Cyrano, let's do the real Cyrano. And I watched Jose Ferrer, who still is my heartthrob Cyrano, and I said, well, I got to go back to the Rostand play. And so I did that. This piece started and went up in Alice Tully Hall in New York City with the Little Orchestra Society, and the narrator was Sally Ann House, and it was 55 minutes long because it was the back half of the concert. What I tried to do, and what I always try to do when I rewrite a Herbert libretto, and I've rewritten 10 of them at this point, I try to keep the spirit of the times, but tell a better story. What they didn't do in those days was they didn't tell a very good story. The first time America had a librettist that told a really, 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 really good story was Oscar Hammerstein II with Showboat. That is true. Now, there were other people. A guy named Henry Blossom wrote very well. A gal named Rita Johnson Young gave us the best American operetta period, and that's Naughty Marietta. And another gal from France named Fred de Grigiac, because she didn't think anybody would listen to a woman, so she went as Fred. She wrote some really nice librettos, all for Herbert, but we didn't have good librettists. So now, 100 years later, we have things like character and conflict and things like that. So what I try to do is deepen the character, create the conflict so that it's there and not happening off stage. I can't tell you how much conflict in operetta happens during the intermission. Perfect example, Mademoiselle Modiste. Fifi wants to be an opera star. She wants to be an opera star. She wants to be an opera star. The intermission comes. When it comes back, she's an opera star. How'd she get there? Lord only knows, but now she's an opera star. Cyrano is the ultimate tragedy. Let's see, I'm watching my time here. Cyrano is the ultimate tragedy. Every single person in this play is hung up on a surface thing. Every single one of them. And only one character in the play makes an arc, moves beyond that hang-up. Cyrano is hung up with his nose. I don't ever like to see Cyrano done with a fake nose, because that takes it into the buffoon. How many of you are hung up on a body part? I'll bet every single one of you has something about yourself that you really hate, and you've hated all your life. In Cyrano's case, he's convinced that it's his nose. In Roxanne's case, she's convinced that beauty is the only thing in the world. Christian is obsessed with the fact that he's shy. It's a classic case of all these people being destroyed by their Achilles heel, with the exception of one character, and I'll let you figure out who that character is. Now, I'm here for a purpose, and that is to hear my work. This has been, it was done in 1999. It sat on a shelf for a long time. And then I compacted it last last fall into what I call a pocket operetta, and then Bruce comes along and says, Alyce, I want to do it, but I want a full evening. So I had to blow it up again. And then Bruce comes along and says, well, I really want you to put this song in. I really want you to put that song in. And I had to figure out how to put those songs in. I don't change any Herbert music, ever. But I do change order, and I occasionally change who sings what song. And if I really have to, and if really push comes to shove, I will change lyrics to fit the situation. But I don't change Herbert's music, because Victor Herbert is the foundation of popular song in America. Keep in mind that Richard Rodgers, Jerome Kern, and who's my other one? Shoot, somebody else. It'll come to me. But those guys grew up going to Herbert operettas. Jerome Kern didn't learn how to write a song spontaneously, okay? He grew up listening to Herbert. So therefore, Herbert is the foundation. And he wrote so much, 45 operettas produced on Broadway. Harry B. Smith wrote 300 plus librettos produced on Broadway. And guess what? With the exception of this one that Bruce Herman and I both love, and some of you may have seen, remember, did you see the Serenade when Lyric Theater did Serenade? That's a great little libretto. It's funny, it's got conflict, it makes sense, there's lots of people in it. It's a Harry B. Smith, but it's probably the best work he ever did. He just kept churning them out, got paid a lot, and there you go. So, I'm here to hear my work. I'm already sitting there taking notes on what I like and what I don't like. I would love to hear from you either at intermission. This is your chance, folks. Find me, I'll be up in the back there. I'd love to hear from you what you like, what you didn't like. If you think it works, does it all hang together? And the biggest thing is, does it make you feel? Because it may be more than 100 years old. How old is this piece? Anybody quick? 1899. How? 1899. No, how old does that make it? 114, thank you. That's what I couldn't do. I knew what date it was, I just couldn't figure out the thing. So it's 114 years old. But Victor Herbert knew the story he was writing for. He wasn't writing for Francis Wilson's buffoon. He was not writing a buffoon. He was writing the real Cyrano. And that's what you will hear. And this is, I guarantee you, the best score you've never heard before. You are going to walk out of here amazed at the beauty of this score. I have, my maestro and I, Dr. Anagnash, we took out a lot of the stuff that was written specifically for Wilson that didn't fly. And so that's gone. But there's still a ton of music, and it's all gorgeous, and you're going to be in for a real treat. So anybody have any questions? Yes?
Did they have black singers participate in these shows?
No. Black singers were not on the New York stage, although by the late 1890s, there were black performers in the minstrel shows. They had finally allowed black people to play black people. You know, the first minstrel shows started in 1830s, and they were all white men, and they all put the black face on. And there were very few, if any, and it took a while before the blacks got enough courage to put together their own minstrel shows. I can't give you an exact date it started, but it was down the road. It certainly wasn't the it's probably, well, it obviously wouldn't have been until after the Civil War, because there wasn't any way slaves were going to put on a minstrel show. That's probably why it started out with black performers. Anybody else? Any questions? As you can tell, my area of expertise is 1830 to 1930. I call it the lost 100 years. Yes, sir?
What do you think was the reason that it was wasn't until about the 1920s or so that American musical theater did incorporate storyline as well as music and conflict and all that together.
I don't think. See, we didn't have a Gilbert. England had a Gilbert, and Gilbert and Sullivan. I don't know if we were afraid of conflict. I just really am not sure. The stories, George M. Cohan first started putting stories into musical comedy, which is musically lesser than operetta. Okay? The major difference between operetta and musical comedy, biggest difference, is if you're going to be an operetta, you better have singers, which is why this failed. This show failed initially. Musical comedy, Rex Harrison proved that you don't have to sing to be in musical comedy. He proved it beyond a shadow of a doubt, but there were lots of people before Rex Harrison who were in musical comedy. The stories, George M. Cohan started at lengthening the story, okay? And George M. Cohan between 1900 and 1910 was it. Everything he touched turned to absolute gold. And he scared the vaudevillians to death because he came out of vaudeville. His family came out of vaudeville. And once he set foot on the New York stage, he never went back. He brought the family with him, but he never went back. Because he knew that was where it was all headed. Anybody else? Yes?
What part of Herbert's lifetime frame did he write this in?
Oh, Herbert lived from 1857 to 1924. He composed instrumental orchestra stuff long before he began the theatrical composition. And in fact, real quick, his first theatrical composition was for something that never happened. It was the Columbia Exposition of 1893. A guy by the name of Steele McKay was going to bring Columbus into Chicago on the Pinta and with the Santa Maria and everything, and he hired Dvorak and Herbert to write the music. But Dvorak had to turn him down because he didn't have time. Dvorak was here in America at that time. But Herbert wrote what was called pantomimic music. It's the first time he wrote for the stage. But the interesting thing about Herbert is that when he wrote his first operetta in 1894, Prince Ananias for the Bostonians, it was a success. He sprung forth fully formed. That's not true of Kern. Kern wrote songs, he doctored shows. It was a long time before Kern actually wrote a completely original show that was his. And Kern ran into good librettists in P.J. Woodhouse and Guy Bolton. However, those were Brits. Brits invaded us long before Andrew Lloyd Webber even thought of it. Long. And I can't tell you what was wrong. They should have let the ladies do more because Rita Johnson Young was wonderful, absolutely wonderful, and so was Fred de Grisiac, who wrote. She wrote the span. If you've seen Sweethearts, how many here have seen Sweethearts? You know that wonderful French scene, where the French woman hits the English barrister and they fight, and the whole thing is in French. That came from Fred de Grisiac. That was the first time she did something for Herbert. And then she wrote Orange Blossoms. Not only wrote Orange Blossoms, which is 1922, but she wrote the play it was based on. So the women were doing pretty well. The men, Henry Blossom was a good librettist. He didn't do much with character. They did things off in the intermission. But he died far too young. He died in, I believe, 1917. He was very young, and it was too bad because he was Herbert's go-to guy. He wrote Mademoiselle Modiste, okay? And so all the way up, Henry Blossom was the go-to guy. And unfortunately, Herbert had to come back to Harry B. Smith after Eileen. Henry Blossom wrote Eileen, which was Herbert's Ode to Ireland. was a wonderful, wonderful script, wonderful score. And then Blossom died, and the only person who really wanted to write was Harry B. And he hadn't come forward. He was too busy. There's a wonderful book that he wrote on his life called First Nights and First Editions. And you think you're going to hear about, my goodness, guy wrote 300 librettos, and he spanned from Robin Hood in 1891 all the way up to 1922? You think you're going to get wonderful stuff, right? He talks about the first edition books he's bought in his life. And to a certain extent, that tells you everything you need to know about Harry B. Smith. Anything else? Yes?
Has the orchestra always been on stage?
No, although actually for this show, yes. Because when we did it in Alice Tully Hall, we did it as a concert version, and the orchestra was on stage. Primarily because the orchestra was Maestro Anagnos's baby, and you didn't put it in a pit. You didn't hide his baby in a pit. So therefore, put the orchestra on stage, put the singers in front, put the chorus in the back, which meant the chorus had to work their little tuchuses off to be heard over the orchestra. It's a way of doing it. Herbert's orchestras, this orchestra is pretty close to what he scored it for. He scored it for about, what is it, 28 usually? No more than 32. Herbert did a lot with instrumentals. Oh, the other thing, you're listening to Mr. Herbert himself because he orchestrated himself. He is the only American composer to orchestrate himself. Everybody else had somebody help. And that includes Richard Rodgers, that includes the great Lenny Bernstein. Lenny Bernstein kind of used to let people think he orchestrated West Side Story. He didn't. There were other guys doing the real orchestrations. And whoever does the orchestrations really controls what it sounds like. The composer can write a melody, but what it sounds like is in the hands of the orchestrator. And Herbert orchestrated himself. So you're going to hear orchestrations and things happening in that orchestra that will surprise you in a wonderful way. He's a genius at orchestration. Robert Russell Bennett was the only person who followed him. There was another guy, Frank Sadler, who did musical comedy. At the same time, Herbert was doing his own operetta. And out of those two people, it came along a young man by the name of Robert Russell Bennett. And Robert Russell Bennett made Richard Rodgers sound like Richard Rodgers. And that included Victor Herbert. So orchestrators are very, very powerful people. But in this case, the man who wrote the music orchestrated it. Anybody else? I think it's time, right? We got to open the house. I will come up and answer those questions up there, okay? So they can open the house. Thank you all very much.